What is the biggest threat to our forests? Is it deforestation, logging, bark beetles, disease, wildfire? Some of those are big threats, but there's one I think a lot of people don't consider, and that is this: Douglas fir. Douglas fir is leading to the death of a lot of our forests, which is a very bold claim to make. After making a claim like that, I think I have some splaining to do. Channel viewers often compliment me on the way I manage my forest land. They say how nice and healthy the forests look. But looks can be deceiving. And a lot of times, the camera doesn't pick up the full story. I think I would change their complimentary language to, I'm doing some of the things I can here with the really bad situation I have here. Fortunately, my situation is not nearly as bad as it is in a lot of places around here. I've been able to hold it off to some degree, but I think time is running out on that. To start doing some splaining, let's take a step outside of the forest so we can see the forest without all these trees in the way and get a more accurate view of what's really going on here. It looks like a good healthy forest from here, but let's take a look at these trees from over there. Pan the camera up. So what? We have a few dead trees here. It's not like we haven't seen dead trees before, but this spot has just started. Let's look over here. It's getting a little bit more advanced over here. A lot of these trees are still green, but they're sickly looking. Maybe you can see all the cones on the one in the middle and the yellowing of the needles. This is what they do right before they die. So what? There's a few more trees over there dying. What's the big deal? Let's go take a closer look. One of the reasons you didn't see many dead trees in that last view is because over the last few years, I have been salvaging them as they die. But we can see the stumps of them. A stump here, stump there, stump there. The ones that are still here standing are the dead ones. This is the way it's been happening a lot in this region. You get a line of trees right along the edge of the forest. They die, then the next ones die, then the next ones die, and sometimes it'll spread clear through the forest. And that's because of Douglas fir. I think I've slowed it down here some because I salvaged the trees as soon as I saw they were dying. Get the bugs out of here before they spread in the spring. That has slowed it down. But it won't be long before these trees in here start looking like these out here. Over here, these ones died. The next ones look like they're gonna go next. That will likely keep going through the stand until they're all dead. I could spend all day showing you examples of places where looks good here, but if you look up, they're not all dead. Some of them are still green, but if you have a trained eye, if you look at the tops of them, the tops are looking sickly and they're on their way out. You can see a lot of pitch running down them as they are fighting off the bugs that are attacking them. Flat-headed fir borers are the bugs that are killing a lot of these trees. A lot of people say it's bark beetles. In this case, they're not beetles, they're borers. This is how it starts in patches like this, and it spreads to the surrounding forest. A lot of times, they will just keep going until there's no more forest left, until they get to the end of the forest. But the bugs are not the problem. The bugs are just a symptom. The problem is the Douglas fir. What we're seeing here is likely just the beginning. Here's a place not super far away from here. Beautiful scenery, but if you take a closer look, the forests are going from green to more of a brown. If you take a close look at these images, you may notice the brown tint to much of the forest. That's from all the dead trees. In many parts of what you can see here, more than half the trees have died in just the last few years. Most of the rest are soon to follow. Yeah, I know I need a better camera to be able to zoom in more clearly, but hopefully you were still able to see some of the extent of the widespread landscape level mortality that's happening, which is just a fancy way of saying the trees are dying all over the place. Now you might be thinking, okay, smarty pants, why are you having such a go at the Douglas fir? Why all the Douglas fir hate? What did they ever do to you? Well, they're dying all over the place. You don't see me going around dying all over the place. If you're watching this video, obviously you haven't been going around dying all over the place, but they are. It may not be entirely the Douglas fir's fault that it's been being so jerky lately. We human types may have had a little bit of an influence in the situation, or a little bit of a lot of an influence in the situation. Back in the before time, in the long ago, we humans came to a couple realizations. One was, Douglas fir makes excellent lumber. As far as softwood lumber goes, it's the best. The other one was, we don't like forest fires. Forest fires are annoying. A lot of times their agendas conflict with our own. So about 100 years ago, we started a zero tolerance policy on forest fires and put out every one we could. What we didn't understand at the time was many of our forests developed under the conditions of having periodic wildfire. In doing so, they became dependent on the conditions those periodic wildfires create. Fire doesn't have to be destructive. A lot of times it'll go through the forest. It will kill some of the trees, especially the smaller, younger trees. Over time, fire would help favor forests with more widely spaced, larger fire-resistant trees, which was a really good thing in areas like this, where we have a hotter, drier climate, like these low-elevation forests around the inland valleys of the West, especially southern Oregon and a lot of California. Having these more widely spaced trees reduces competition. There's more resources available for each tree, especially water, which is very important in these drought-prone areas. Like Stan Mapolsky, the road gardener, says, around here, drought is normal. Long periods of time without drought here are unusual. In order for our forests to be able to survive here, it's important that they are drought resistant, which is what, over time, the forests here have adapted to be. Then a bunch of us wise guys came over from Europe and decided, we're going to start doing things differently around here. Instead of doing things the way nature's been doing it for ever since nature started doing things that way, we're going to start putting out all the wildfires, and we're going to grow a lot of Douglas fir lumber. Because Douglas fir lumber is awesome. Douglas fir is native here. It's a natural component of the forest, but they're not very drought resistant. They can be drought resistant to some degree, but not so much under the extreme high temperatures we sometimes have here, especially extended periods of high temperature. If I walk around a place like this, I will occasionally run into the old remnants of the old growth that used to be here. A lot of times the old stumps will be ponderosa pine, incense cedar, some of the more drought tolerant species, but only an occasional Douglas fir like this one that lived long enough to become a big tree. Most of these I will find on the better growing sites, places with deeper soil, on the shady side of the hill where it's less hot and dry. But a lot of these low elevation forests were dominated by more fire and drought tolerant species like pine, oak, incense cedar. These conditions were maintained by periodic wildfire. But what happened when those wise guys started putting out the wildfires that maintained the forest? Douglas fir was often more of a minor component to the forest, but they can be very prolific seed producers. If you start looking closely at the ground, every year it's common to have these little Douglas fir trees coming up all over the place. If you look closely, they're all over the place. Back when we had periodic wildfire, the wildfires would come through, burn through the blanket of pine needles and oak leaves on the forest floor. One of the ways fire-adapted species like our pines and our oaks keep out a lot of the competition, they put down a highly flammable blanket of leaves and needles on the ground, which dry out quickly, and they easily support fire and kill out the competition. I don't know if they do this on purpose, if they came up with that idea, but it seems to work out well for them. On a rare occasion, there will be a seedling that'll come up in a spot where there's not much around it to burn. Occasionally, one of those will survive a wildfire. If they do that enough over the decades, that is what ends up being the occasional tree that survives. That's how we end up with these widely scattered trees. That is until some wise guys came along and said, let's start putting all those wildfires out. When there were no more wildfires, all those little seedlings started to grow, especially the Douglas fir. That is how our forests started getting taken over by Douglas fir. Since the pines don't have fire anymore to keep the Douglas fir out, they grow up thick around the pines. They start pulling a lot of the water out of the ground. When there isn't as much water available for the pines, they get stressed. Then the bark beetles take them out. A lot of these low elevation forests were also dominated by these big oaks. Very important for wildlife. Any deer hunters out there can tell you how important these are for wildlife. They also put down this thick mat of leaves. They dry quickly, they're very flammable. These are great at supporting low intensity ground fire that would normally take out these little Douglas firs. Since we took fire away, all those little Douglas fir seedlings all over the place grew up into this massive thicket of Douglas fir you can see as far as you can see, which are starting to overtop and will eventually shade out and kill all these big oaks. Same thing with the big old madrones in here. Douglas fir are about to overtop them. The madrones are not quite as drought tolerant as the oak. They're still drought tolerant. If the Douglas fir don't outshade them, what they will do is they will pull so much water out of the ground. These madrones that have been here for hundreds of years, they won't have the ability to endure drought as well as they did back when they used to have this whole spot all to themselves. That is just one way we have completely altered a lot of our forests just by taking away periodic wildfire. That would include places that people would think would be untouched, remote wilderness, virgin forests, unlogged, untouched. They've all been altered because we took fire away from them too. Later on, we humans, with all of our infinite wisdom, went out into the forest. We saw all these young Douglas fir getting established. Then we saw these hardwood trees and thought, these hardwood trees are competing with the Douglas fir. We need to get rid of these hardwood trees. We didn't want these hardwood trees here that had been growing here for hundreds of years because they were competing with the Douglas fir. We wanted to grow Douglas fir because it makes such good lumber. Our western hardwoods aren't that desirable for making lumber. They can be problematic. There's never been much of a hardwood lumber industry out here. We want to grow Douglas fir. So to foresters, the hardwoods that have been here for hundreds of years are drought resistant and very important for wildlife were looked at as just weeds. So we cut them down, we girdled them, we poisoned them, we got rid of them and created forests of Douglas fir because we want Douglas fir lumber, because Douglas fir lumber is awesome. Why did we do a lot of these things? Same reason why we do a lot of the things we do. Because at the time, we thought we were doing the right thing. When we harvest the trees in this area, which we do because we all use wood products, it's an important thing to us. And when we're done, instead of going back and replanting or reestablishing species like oak or other species that can handle our kind of drought and high heat, what do? We replant Douglas fir. Now, a few decades later, after getting rid of a lot of the oaks and other more heat and drought tolerant species, converting our forests into Douglas fir dominated forests on a massive scale, we are now starting to realize, oh, Douglas fir doesn't do well here. It's just too hot and too dry here to be growing Douglas fir, except a few of the better growing sites. They do okay when they're young, but they get to a certain size like this, where the insects really like them at this stage. We go through a period of hot, dry weather, they die. And the larger they get, the more difficult it is for their vascular systems to handle extreme temperatures. If only we would have known that before we started unintentionally converting our forest to Douglas fir by putting fires out, and intentionally doing it by cutting down the hardwoods in favor of the Douglas fir and only planting Douglas fir. Now we have entire forests that are dying because they're Douglas fir. In a place like this where we're on the shady side of the hill, we're down in a canyon, it's a cooler, wetter, deeper soiled spot, Douglas fir does great. If you go up in elevation into a cooler, wetter climate around here, Douglas fir does just fine. If we go over to the coast, which is a cooler, wetter climate, Douglas fir does amazing. If you get up north into northern Oregon, northwest Oregon, Washington, British Columbia, Douglas fir is an amazing tree. They grow up to be huge. They'll live for hundreds of years. In all those areas where Douglas fir grows very well, where it can naturally be the dominant trees in the area, it makes sense to grow them there. But in these low elevation, inland, hot weather regions, it only does well in a few places like this. Douglas fir is not an invasive species like an introduced species. It is native here, but since we started putting out periodic wildfire and favoring Douglas fir because we want the lumber, it is behaving like an invasive species all over this region. It has dominated the forest in places where it just doesn't do well. It does well for a while if you establish it in cooler, wetter times. Then when we go through times of extreme heat and drought, they die. If I had more time to travel around, or maybe more importantly, more desire to do it, I could show you some really good footage of some of the massive devastation that's happened from these massive Douglas fir die-offs. But hopefully from this blurry image, you can pick out how much brown is within the green. On some screens, you may just have to use your imagination. Here, it's still only a few pockets, but they're increasing and spreading at an alarming rate. This is the way I've seen it happen in other areas. I think what we're seeing here is just the beginning. Now that we've converted so much of our forest into Douglas fir and are now starting to realize, oh, Douglas fir doesn't do well here. Now what do we do?